Hey Optimancers, Chris here. In my last video I discussed the rules for ability checks and some ways that DMs use ability checks that aren't covered in the rules. And in today's video I'm going to be covering the 18 skills in D&D, what the rules say about them, and I'm going to give players some ideas how to use a skill that never seems to come up otherwise. And I'm going to give some ideas for DMs who want to make sure that every skill in the game is useful. As always, I'm sharing what the rules say, and I'm going to share some of my experiences, thoughts, and ideas. But if I suggest anything in this video that isn't for you, then continue to enjoy your games as you've been before watching this. My goal here is to give you some options that maybe you haven't considered before. Before I go through the individual skills, I want to share something I started doing as a DM and explain why I do it. So in my last video, I highlighted that the rules say it's the DM who calls for an ability check involving a skill and determines what the ability check will be. When I started playing and DMing D&D, I'd call for an ability check using a skill, and when a player would say, hey, can I use this other ability and skill instead, I usually said yes. I mean, as long as it wasn't absurd, like, can I use insight instead of history or something like that, but that didn't happen very often. But let's say I call for a strength athletics check for climbing a wall, and then they asked if they could use dexterity acrobatics instead. I'd normally say yes, because it seems like the nice thing to do. And there is this popular idea that a DM should always, or at least usually, say yes. I am far more restrictive these days, and there is a reason for it. If I allow a player to use acrobatics for checks that should use athletics, then I'm essentially making being proficient in both skills worthless. And that is a punishment for a character that has both. Here's an example where that happened very recently. The party was in a combat and winning, and one player decided their character was going to try to get the enemy to surrender by threatening to kill them if they didn't. I called for a charisma intimidation check, and they asked me if they could use persuasion instead. And let's be clear, the reason they asked this is because they weren't proficient in intimidation and they were in persuasion. And I get that. It is totally understandable why they asked. But if I'm trying to determine how intimidated the enemy was by the threat, the character's ability to intimidate seemed appropriate to me. And I had already called for the check, and so in the end, that's the check I had them make. If you can just tick the persuasion skill and it covers cases where I call for intimidation or deception, then there's no point in being proficient in those skills. And in my view, this punishes the player who created a character that has more skill proficiencies. Because if we're going to talk about game balance, more proficiencies is supposed to give you a mechanical advantage. Allowing a player to actually benefit from that advantage requires giving value to every skill proficiency as the rules prescribe. And if players can just switch the ability check that the DM called for, then that value is being robbed from the skill-focused player character. Now, maybe the character could have used persuasion to convince this enemy to surrender. Sometimes a challenge can be overcome with more than one skill. But they would have needed to have worded their encouragement for the enemy to surrender in a way where I felt persuasion was the appropriate skill to use for the charisma check. Also, if I had felt at the time that their attempt could be either intimidation or persuasion, I'd give them the choice when they made the check. Because I don't think it's necessary to be a brick wall, but there is a happy medium between brick wall and jellyfish. All that said, I do want to encourage all you players out there to consider what task you might achieve with a skill on your character sheet and ask your DM if you can. Quite often, maybe even most of the time, the DM isn't calling for an ability check to say, predict an enemy's next move in combat. If you think that could be a valuable thing to do, you can ask your DM whether you might be able to do that with a wisdom insight check. Now, the DM may very reasonably require that you use your action, or they might even say no. But it is okay to ask, and it's really unlikely they'll think to present that to you as an option. Instead, it's on you to ask if it is. So I'm going to go over each skill, and I'll show what the rules say about that skill, and for some of them, a lot of them really, I'm not going to need to provide any ideas on how to make the skill relevant in your games because it's probably relevant already. You don't need me to give you ideas on how to use stealth. But when it comes to the ones that are used less often, I'm going to give some tips how you as a player can use them more often, and for DMs, how you can call on them more often. So let's start with athletics. Covers difficult situations of climbing, jumping, and swimming. In other words, you do not need to call for an ability check necessarily every time a character tries to swim, jump, or climb. just cases where a character faces difficult situations that make the results uncertain. So if a character has a strength of 10, they can make a 10-foot running long jump. There shouldn't be a check necessary. However, let's say they need to clear a 15-foot distance. Well, you could call for an athletics check to see if they can cover that extra 5 feet. Whether you require that attempt to use an action is up to you. Challenges for climbing, jumping, and swimming come up all the time in D&D, to the point where I, as a player, usually take proficiency in athletics even if I'm not playing a strength-based character. I'll rather have a +2 over a -1. But there's even more. Athletics is used when you attempt to grapple or shove, and can be used in a contested check to avoid being grappled or shoved. Now, the elephant in the room is this is likely not going to be the case anymore when the new player's handbook is published, as grappling and shoving involves a saving throw rather than a contested check in the playtest, and I suspect that's what's going to end up being in the 2024 player's handbook. And I know a lot of players have divided views on this, but here is one benefit of this change that maybe you haven't considered. Athletics is a pretty useful skill. With the 2014 rules for grappling and shoving, it becomes just way more important than other skill proficiencies. Removing that mechanic does not make athletics underpowered, but it does balance it off significantly, removing what is potentially a must pick. Acrobatics. So the rules say that acrobatics is used when your character might be challenged to stay on their feet, such as running across a sheet of ice, bouncing on a tightrope, or staying upright on a ship's deck when it's rocking. Acrobatics is also used for performing acrobatic stunts, such as dives, rolls, somersaults, and flips. Acrobatics can be used as an alternative for athletics for opposing attempts to grapple or shove. Again, for now, this is likely not going to be the case when the rules are updated. And what this is going to change is, if I'm not making a character that grapples or shoves, then I could take acrobatics instead of athletics to at least avoid being grappled or shoved. So there would be this kind of choice on every character, acrobatics or athletics. But it looks like taking neither is going to be a valid option come the update. What acrobatics isn't used as an alternative for athletics for is for jumping, climbing, and swimming. Those are athletics. Balancing, flipping, rolling, diving. Those are acrobatics. That's how you keep both skills relevant, by ensuring they aren't interchangeable. And acrobatics is one that I don't think I need to give ways to make it useful. Things like narrow ledges, tightropes, keeping your footing on treacherous ground, these things come up in D&D on their own. However, here is one additional use of acrobatics that I personally allow as a DM. If a player asks if their character can move through a space occupied by an enemy that they normally couldn't move through, I'll give them a chance to do it using a dexterity acrobatics check. I normally require an action to attempt it, and if they ask why they can't do it without an action, the answer is because they didn't play a halfling, because halfling nimbleness would allow it without an action or an ability check at all. Just another way halflings are awesome. Sleight of Hand. So what I've normally seen with Sleight of Hand is using it to pick pockets. And if pockets aren't being picked, this is one of those skills I seldom see used, which is a shame. Because really, Sleight of Hand should be something that could replicate anything a trained magician can do with, Sleight of Hand. So Penn and Teller have explained very well what a trained magician can do with Sleight of Hand. They call it the 7 principles of magic, so I'm just going to pass along their wisdom. Palm, the ability to hold an object in what is apparently an empty hand. Ditch, to dispose of an object without being detected. Steal, to obtain an object without being detected. Load, to move an object from one place to another without being detected. Simulation, to give the impression that something that hasn't happened has. Misdirection, to take attention away from the secret move. And switch, to secretly exchange one object for another. If you haven't watched their routine on Sleight of Hand, it is one of my favorite magic routines, so I'm going to link a video you can watch up above. Of course, in D&D, we have a world where real magic exists, and it's even common. But if it's something that could be achieved by Teller, who isn't casting spells, it's something a character might be able to achieve through Sleight of Hand, and detect magic sure ain't going to work. This is one of those skills where it can really be up to the player to pull these stunts. And speaking of magic, if a spellcaster wants to do their somatic components in a concealed way, I would totally call for a dexterity sleight of hand check. So let's say, for example, the party is given an audience with a potential enemy, and they're instructed to leave their weapons at the door. They're patted down to ensure all weapons are removed. Your belt sheath is revealed, and you're instructed to leave the dagger with the other weapons. Steal, secretly obtain one of the pitons from your pouch. Palm, conceal the piton in your other hand. Misdirection, take attention away from the dagger in your hand. Switch, now the dagger and the piton are switched. Simulation, give the impression the dagger, not the piton, was tossed on the pile. Then ditch, the dagger is concealed back in your clothes. And finally, load, move the dagger back to its sheath as you head to the meeting. Your DM will not think to offer this option to players who have Sleight of Hand, but if you can convince your DM that a magician could pull off that stunt, then a character with Sleight of Hand should be able to pull it off too. Just don't roll poorly. Stealth. So, hiding, sneaking, moving silently, you probably know this one well enough, and yes, opportunities to use stealth come up all the time. And no, stealth isn't real magic either. No matter how high your stealth score is, you still can't hide when you're in plain sight. However, invisibility only conceals you visually. An invisible dirty goblin still makes noise, they still compress the grass they're standing on, and they still smell like a dirty goblin. So, if you're a DM, the player should still know the location of an invisible creature, unless they attempt to conceal their location by watching their step, breathing shallowly, standing downwind. In other words, use an action and make a dexterity stealth check, or a bonus action if you have 2 levels in rogue. What I'm saying is that invisibility and stealth are not interchangeable by the rules, and if you make invisibility equal stealth and vice versa, what you're doing is shortchanging characters that can turn invisible and are stealthy. Stealth is also the skill used for ability checks to obtain surprise in combat. Yet another thing that looks like it might be different with the new player's handbook. If you've read or heard online that Pass Without Trace is a must-have spell, well, that might change once the new player's handbook is published. Maybe. It is still up in the air what's happening with surprise. Stealth, though, is probably a skill that you use all the time, or call for all the time as a DM, without needing any guidance from me. Arcana. So the rules say an intelligence arcana check is made to recall lore about spells, magic items, eldritch symbols, magical traditions, the planes of existence, and the inhabitants of those planes. In published modules, Arcana is one of the skills that gets called on pretty regularly. There's something strange and magical in nature. An intelligence arcana check is almost certain to be called out as a way to gain information. But Arcana is also one of those skills, like Athletics, that has built-in game uses. In Xanathars, we have rules for identifying a spell that somebody else is casting. The character can use their reaction to identify the spell being cast by succeeding on an Intelligence Arcana check against the DC equal to 15 plus a spell's level. Advantage is applied to the check if the spell being cast is a class spell and the character is a member of that class. And I should add, just to be complete, that in the same book, you can use an Arcana skill to craft scrolls. There's no ability check required, you just need proficiency in Arcana. Now, when I'm running the game, I would also call for an Arcana check if the player wants more information about an unfamiliar monster that was created by magic or is from another plane of existence. Other than the upper or lower planes, I would use religion for that. Then in Tasha's, they gave us some rules for researching different monster types with suggested skills, and Arcana is all over the place on this chart. These are kind of weird rules though. Like, I guess you research a monster type, no guidance on how long that takes or what resources are required for your research, and then you determine what the monster desires with a random roll of a d4. Anyways, the rules are here for DMs who want to use them. Religion, survival, nature, history, and animal handling are listed here as well. In the playtest, there's what in my opinion is a far more useful way for a player to use Arcana. Using the study action can give you more information about aberrations, constructs, elementals, fae, and monstrosities specifically. So if you come up against some kind of elemental you aren't familiar with, and maybe you're wondering about immunities or resistances, vulnerabilities, or other statistics and abilities, your DM can use an Intelligence Arcana check to reveal how much information your character might know about this particular kind of elemental. Intelligence-based skills, with the exception of investigation, are all based around knowledge and learning, including Arcana. So if a player is curious what knowledge their character has on a topic, an ability check with the relevant knowledge-based skill seems to me to be the obvious solution. But it does appear that's heading towards being highlighted more specifically in the updated rules. So yeah, I think Arcana is a good skill to have at most tables. History measures your ability to recall lore about historical events, legendary people, ancient kingdoms, past disputes, recent wars, and lost civilizations. So if I look at the Legend Lore spell, this is a 5th level spell, and it provides you lore for a person, place, or object. And the only thing Legend Lore does that the history skill shouldn't is provide information that your character couldn't possibly know otherwise. In all other cases, an intelligence history check should be perfectly appropriate. So let's say you're exploring the ruins of an ancient civilization, and you ask, what kind of traps did this civilization tend to use? Well, I would call for an intelligence history check. Then you ask, how are they wiped out? Intelligence history. What kind of magic items might have been kept in such a structure? Intelligence history. Am I calling for any of these checks without the player asking? Probably not. But that doesn't mean that if a player asks if they might know this information, I wouldn't ask for a check. If I think there's a chance they might know, I'm calling for the check. So if your character is good at intelligence history checks, there is the opportunity to make that useful, but it's probably going to be on you to ask the questions. I should also point out that in the playtest, they suggest intelligence history checks for getting more information regarding creatures of the giant or humanoid types, and that's only 2 types of creatures, but damn, there are a lot of humanoids in D&D. Using intelligence checks to determine what kind of tricks you might expect from a Shadowkai soulmonger, that could be extremely useful. So it seems like even more uses for history are going to be hard-coded into the game. Investigation. When you look around for clues and make deductions based on those clues, you make an intelligence investigation check. You might deduce the location of a hidden object, discern from the appearance of a wound what kind of weapon dealt it, or determine the weakest point in a tunnel that could cause it to collapse. Poring through ancient scrolls in search of a hidden fragment of knowledge might also call for an intelligence investigation check. Now, it is interesting to go through these base rules again because I was surprised that identifying the type of weapon that caused a wound was investigation, because at least lately I've been calling for wisdom medicine checks for that, and that's been my experience as a player as well. Now, here's something I noticed has changed in games I play and run. The 2014 Player's Handbook has a sidebar recommending that finding traps and secret doors should require a wisdom perception check. Now, I don't recall the first time I read an adventure that intelligence investigation was required to find a secret door or find a trap, but I will tell you that when it happened, it made so much sense to me that I have completely adopted it. My recommendation for differentiating investigation and perception is that if you are actively searching for something, that's investigation, because you're investigating. If the check is made to notice something that you aren't actively searching for, I would call for a wisdom perception check. So you're walking down the hallway and you notice something odd on the wall that turns out to be a secret door? Sure, that's perception. But I'm checking the wall for secret doors, investigation. So obviously in a game called Dungeons & Dragons, that would be useful. And if a character discovers a trap and is trying to figure out what it might do or how it works, I figure that's intelligence investigation as well. Now, if you are running the official published adventures, I will say that normally they still call for wisdom perception checks to find secret doors. But they call for a lot of intelligence investigation checks for other things as well. And if it's noticing something like magic treasure on a body or in a room, you could flip a coin for which skill they call for. Nature. Your intelligence nature check measures your ability to recall lore about terrain, plants, and animals, the weather, and natural cycles. Now, one of the weird things about the nature skill is that because it's tied to intelligence and not wisdom, it means that druids, who you think should be the class that embodies this skill, rangers too, but to a smaller degree, because at least since Tashes they have the possibility of expertise, are working off what is normally a low ability score for nature checks. So wizards tend to be better nature experts than druids, which feels off. Though again, it looks like this is going to be addressed in the new Player's Handbook, as at least in the playtest, druids have an option that allows them to add their wisdom modifier to intelligence nature checks. Rangers also have an advantage to some terrain-based nature checks. We'll see what makes the official publication, but it's nice to see druids get an option to make them good at these checks. When it comes to beasts and plant creatures, intelligence nature is the obvious skill to use. What's bigger is, it looks like with the new Player's Handbook, we're going to be adding oozes, and more importantly, dragons to intelligence nature checks. So if the game is Dungeons and Dragons, and there are a ton of dragons, especially since Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, but it's also just one of those monster types that gets homebrewed constantly, because it's Dungeons and Dragons. They're just a major part of the game, and I can't even keep track which kind of dragon has what kind of breath weapon anymore, like whether it's a cone or a line, or does radiant damage, force damage, does it impose conditions, what kind of saving throw is involved. There's so much to keep track of, I can't. At least in theory, that information should be available to my character by making a successful intelligence nature check. Once the study action is available, you can just use that, but until it's official, ask your DM if you might know that information, and they can call for the check if they think you might. So I found this skill to come up less than the other knowledge-based skills in the past. I mean, even though it lists recalling knowledge about terrain in the base skill, I find Wisdom Survival is the ability check called for when it comes to the important stuff, like avoiding hazards and finding food, but it appears at least that the skill will see increased value moving forward. Religion. Your intelligence religion check measures your ability to recall lore about deities, rites, and prayers, religious hierarchies, holy symbols, and the practice of secret cults. So, the evil secret cult operating in the metropolitan area or in the hidden temple, these things are iconic in D&D. And usually the first thing you find is a symbol, and there's going to be an intelligence religion check to recognize it and gain information on the goals, practices, and motivations of the cult. I've also always used intelligence religion ability checks to recall information regarding celestials and fiends. And fiends come up a lot in D&D. There's demons, devils, Yugoloths, creatures from entire planes that are based on being the bad guys. And so that's a really easy way to establish who the bad guys are. So DMs use them all the time. They also pretty much universally have resistances, immunities, weird attack routines, unusual powers, and so just for that knowledge of these creatures alone, the religion skill can be handy. The only more iconic bad guys are maybe undead, and I used to use Arcana to recall knowledge about undead because I figured, hey, they're created by magic. But I'm using religion now because it looks like that's what's going to be the standard come the new player's handbook. And religion makes sense too. And you know what? Arcana has enough going for it, so giving religion the undead knowledge thing is probably good for balance as well. Like with nature, it's been weird to have the wizard better at religion than the cleric. And like the druid, it looks like it's going to be corrected in the new player's handbook, with clerics having an option to add their wisdom modifier to their intelligence religion checks. Animal handling. When there is any question whether you can calm down a domesticated animal, keep a mount from getting spooked, or intuit an animal's intentions, the DM might call for a wisdom animal handling check. You also make a wisdom animal handling check to control your mount when you attempt a risky maneuver. And in the playtest, the influence action allows a character to use animal handling to influence beasts and monstrosities, but not a wisdom animal handling check, a charisma animal handling check. Now, I don't know if the intention is to just switch the associated ability score from wisdom to charisma, or if the character is just using charisma with animal handling for the influence action. It is going to be interesting to see. But I want to go back to the rules for the base skill. So it says here that you can use the skill to keep a mount from getting spooked, or control your mount when you attempt a risky maneuver. But the mounted combat rules don't talk about either of these uses, or reference the animal handling skill at all. So if you're a DM and you want animal handling to be more relevant, well, here is your opportunity. The mounted combat rules in D&D are vague and poorly worded, and I think most of us realize they need revision, and we're hoping that the 2024 Player's Handbook will include a better set of rules for mounted combat. But here's your rules support for ways to enhance the rules on mounted combat that we have. Even a trained mount can be spooked, and just because the mounted combat rules don't cover it doesn't make it not so. You can reference the rules right here to show that, yes, mounts can be spooked, and animal handling is a check to keep them under control. You want to spur the mount to take that long jump? Well, here we have some rule support to require a wisdom animal handling check for that as well. The animal handling skill says right here it should make you better at riding in these ways, but it is up to the DM to make sure that's the case. By the way, if a character ever mounts a creature that isn't trained for combat, but I think it could potentially be a mount, I am calling for a wisdom animal handling check. Also, if a player kills the orc on that direwolf and then tries to use that direwolf as a mount, that's going to be animal handling too, 100%. And as a player, if you're wondering if something on the battlefield might be controlled as a mount, or if you can raise that baby griffin to be a mount, ask your DM if you could use animal handling, because they might not have considered that without you mentioning it. Insight. Your wisdom insight check decides whether you can determine the true intentions of a creature, such as searching out a lie or predicting someone's next move. Doing so involves gleaning clues from body language, speech habits, and changes in mannerisms. Here's where I see insight called upon most often. Do I think they're lying? Well, make an insight check. And this interaction, honestly, it's a bit weird, or it's a bit clunky, I think. I figure, although there is definitely training you can do to signal that someone is potentially being dishonest with you, there shouldn't really be a way to be 100% certain. But if someone rolls well on a wisdom insight check to determine if someone is lying, and then you say, you think they might be lying, or you think they're probably being truthful, well, maybe you're saying that their character isn't 100% certain, but as a player, you can be pretty certain. They are probably being truthful. Well, I guess they're being truthful because I rolled really well. And honestly, I haven't really employed any solutions to this hiccup. I usually just roll with it. The character rolled high on a wisdom insight, way higher than the NPC's deception, so I guess they know. Anyways, turning your character into a lie detector that actually works reliably, it's obviously useful. And do you remember that earlier in this video, I referenced asking if you could use insight to predict an enemy's next move in combat? Well, here is your rule support for that right here. Medicine. A wisdom medicine check lets you try to stabilize a dying companion or diagnose an illness. So, this is one skill with a hard-coded use, and that is stabilizing a creature. The rules on stabilizing a creature say that if you use an action and succeed on a DC 10 wisdom medicine check, you can stabilize a creature with 0 hit points so they don't have to make death saving throws. The thing is, this isn't all that valuable. There are tons of ways to heal your allies built into spells, class features, racial features, magic items, feats, and so on, that there's just more effective ways to stabilize a creature with 0 hit points, and they don't call for wisdom medicine checks. But even if you don't have any healing resources, you can automatically stabilize a dying creature with a cantrip, or a healer's kit available in the equipment section of the player's handbook. So it is pretty rare for that DC 10 check to ever come up. Like I indicated earlier, if I'm the DM, I tend to call for wisdom medicine checks for gaining information about wounds. If a creature died because it was poisoned, or stabbed with a dagger, or clawed by some large-sized creature, figuring that out is something I would call for a wisdom medicine check for. I might also ask about poisons, diseases, how long a dead creature has been dead. These things too I would think would fall under wisdom medicine. Here is one question I thought of that I think would be reasonable. Can I determine approximately how many hit points that creature has left using medicine? It would probably be an action, but potentially useful. Not in the rules, but you can ask your DM. And if you're a DM and you want to make medicine more impactful, here's a thought. When characters take a short rest, offer anyone who wants to use a healer's kit to tend the party's wounds a medicine check. DC 10, and they restore 1 extra hit point per hit die spent. DC 20, and it's 2. DC 30, and it's 3. This is not in the rules. It would be a house rule, but it kind of makes sense, right? Perception. Your wisdom perception check lets you spot, hear, or otherwise detect the presence of something. Measures your general awareness of your surroundings and the keenness of your senses. For example, you might try to hear a conversation through a closed door, eavesdrop under an open window, or hear monsters moving stealthily in the forest. Or you might try to spot things that are obscured or easy to miss, whether they are orcs lying in ambush on a road, thugs hiding in the shadows of an alley, or candlelight under a closed secret door. So here's where perception is hard-coded into the rules, if the DM is determining if there is surprise in combat. The creatures that are potentially surprised make wisdom perception checks opposed by the dexterity stealth checks of the creatures trying to ambush. Surprise can be an overwhelming factor in combat, turns hard combats into easy combats, and easy combats into deadly encounters. Losing your ability to act on the first round of a combat is devastating. So of course perception is extremely important. Now I can't confirm this 100%, but I suspect surprise is going to look different in the 2024 Player's Handbook, and I would not be shocked if it's just gone entirely. And if I am correct, this will have a massive impact on what is currently an overwhelming importance of a good wisdom perception modifier. And I mentioned this when I covered investigation, but hearing a noise, that's perception. Eavesdropping through a door, perception. Notice something without searching, perception. And according to the rules, perception should be for doing secret doors and traps. But if you move those over to investigation, perception is still well worth taking. Survival. The DM might ask you to make a wisdom survival check to follow tracks, hunt wild game, guide your group through frozen wastelands, identify signs that owl bears live nearby, predict the weather, or avoid quicksand and other natural hazards. So there is some overlap here with the nature skill, which also talks about the weather, for example. And I've often seen printed instructions for a character to either make an intelligence nature check or a wisdom survival check for the exact same information. But when it comes to navigating treacherous terrain, I always see wisdom survival called for, as well as for hunting or finding fresh water. And I call for it as well in those circumstances. The other big one for survival is finding tracks, identifying tracks, and following tracks. Now, sometimes an adventure specifically talks about using wisdom survival to follow tracks, and sometimes it doesn't. If you want to track something, make sure to ask if you can, because if it's not actually written in the adventure to have the players make wisdom survival checks to find and follow tracks, then they probably won't call for a check unless you ask. It is a reasonably useful skill, but often a party is okay as long as one character can make wisdom survival checks reliably, as it tends to be one character that makes the check, and if they're successful, the whole party navigates the swamp, or finds their dinner, or can follow the tracks. Then again, the playtest rules for assisting ability checks requires the assisting character to be proficient in the skill or tool in order to give assistance. So if that makes it through to the new Player's Handbook, you may want more than one person proficient. Deception. Your charisma deception check determines whether you can convincingly hide the truth, either verbally or through your actions. This deception can encompass everything from misleading others through ambiguity to telling outright lies. Typical situations include trying to fast talk a guard, con a merchant, earn money through gambling, pass yourself off in a disguise, dull someone's suspicions with false assurances, or maintain a straight face while telling a blatant lie. I don't think I need a big explanation of this one. You want to trick someone or feed them false information by one method or another, your DM is probably calling for a charisma deception check, often opposed by wisdom insight. It is obviously useful for somebody in your party to be good at this, as long as your DM doesn't just let you switch it to persuasion willy-nilly. I will say that as a DM, I've passed off a bit of what is listed here to another skill, which I'm going to get to shortly, but first, let's talk about intimidation. When you attempt to influence someone through overt threats, hostile actions, and physical violence, the DM might ask you to make a charisma intimidation check. Examples include trying to pry information out of a prisoner, convincing street thugs to back down from a confrontation, or using the edge of a broken bottle to convince a sneering vizier to reconsider a decision. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, it is fairly common, depending on the type of intimidation being used, but if it's physical intimidation, to call for the intimidation skill in tandem with strength instead of charisma. That said, I have heard arguments that intimidation should just be a strength-based skill, period. And I have to disagree. The most intimidating characters I read about in books or see in movies aren't flexing their muscles. Hans Londra in Inglourious Bastards, the Joker in Batman, Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, Frank Booth in Blue Velvet, in Goodfellas when Tommy says, "I'm funny how? Funny like a clown? I amuse you?" It's intimidating, but not because he's a big guy. Joe Pesci is not a big guy. Now, I will say that a lot of the challenges that can be handled with intimidation can also be handled with deception or persuasion. Maybe both of them. Depends how it's being handled. For example, let's say you have a prisoner and you need some information from them. If a character tells the prisoner their partner already blabbed the information and now they look really bad, so maybe they want to correct the record, well, that would be charisma deception. If you buddy up to them and then you build a rapport and get the information, well, that would be charisma persuasion. And if you convince them, if they don't start talking, bad things are about to happen, that's charisma intimidation. So a lot of people don't bother taking all three skills because often you can achieve the same goals by employing a different charisma skill. But be careful how you roleplay it, like in my example before. But if I am the DM, I am trying to put myself in the shoes of the creature being influenced. And maybe I can't be persuaded to let the characters through this door, but I can be intimidated. Or maybe it's just a different DC. I think the game works better if these skills aren't just interchangeable. Performance. Your charisma performance check determines how well you can delight an audience with music, dance, acting, storytelling, or some other form of entertainment. So how often can performance come up in the game? I mean, fairly often. Most adventures start in the local tavern, but the real question is, how often are those performance checks really vital or important? And that's not very often. So in order to make this skill more useful, we do need to be a bit creative. What I will say is, as a DM, if someone wants to pass themselves off as someone else, often in tandem with a disguise or an illusion, then I call for a charisma performance check rather than a charisma deception check. Because I figure they're not just lying, they're mimicking somebody else, and acting is a type of performance. I figure performance is probably the right skill to call for whenever a character is trying to get the attention of a large group of people or other creatures. Here's another way a DM might use performance. Convincing a single creature to take a certain course of action might be persuasion, while convincing a group of creatures to take a certain course of action might be performance. Let me give you an example. Let's just imagine for a moment that we're running a game and the players are debating a course of action and they can't make a decision. I know, this is far-fetched. Now you can, and I have, is just instruct the players to make a decision. But what you could do is you could have the various players championing different courses of action all make charisma performance checks, and the one with the highest result is the most convincing in game. Obviously, I'm not saying that we should be forcing anyone to take actions with their character that they're against doing. But sometimes just a nudge like this, like you found this person really convincing, that might be all that's required to get everyone on the same page. As a player, the words I would remember are, can I use performance to fill in the blank? Because there are some pretty reasonable cases where performance could be used in cases where other charisma-based skills might also be used. Persuasion. When you attempt to influence someone or a group of people with tact, social graces, or good nature, the DM might ask you to make a charisma persuasion check. Typically you use persuasion when acting in good faith, to foster friendships, to make cordial requests, or exhibit proper etiquette. Examples of persuading others include convincing a chamberlain to let your party see the king, negotiating peace between warring tribes, or inspiring a crowd of townsfolk. Of all the charisma-based skills, I find personally that persuasion comes up the most all on its own. You want an NPC or NPCs to act a certain way, calm down if they're hostile, or perform a certain action. If the DM considers it feasible, it's probably going to be a charisma persuasion roll unless you specifically employ deception or intimidation, or perhaps if performance can be involved. But usually persuasion is the default. So it's a very good skill all on its own without any guidance for me. And that is my guide on skills, how they're used, what they cover, which I find more or less valuable, and ways to make them more relevant in your games. And with that, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. Mage level supporters on Patreon saw this video early and didn't need an ad blocker to avoid those YouTube ads. They can also participate in my exclusive patron chat on Discord and get a personal thank you monthly in my videos. Check out Mage level support on my Patreon page, linked in the video description. Today, I would like to thank Hey Mr. Wonderful, Babrak, Blue Wolf, John D, Descarpus9, El Conquistadorito, Jared Huberger, John Wayne, Joseph Hall, Joseph Robideau, Joseph Rogers, Wu Carl Kong, Lila Corpsegrave, Michael Michelle, Moxie, Nemo, Paul Suzak, Prometheo NTG, Reichenstahl, Rico, Ryan Wilmot, Shane and Todd Beyond, Starfall, Stephen Melling, Earshine, Third, and Wade.